25,000 feet above Berlin. March 6, 1944. Sergeant Walter Wally Bennett is curled into the fetal position inside the Sperry Ball turret of the B-17 Lady Luck. The temperature inside his suspended plexiglass sphere is -50 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze sweat before it drips. Through the frost-rimmed glass between his knees, he watches the Focke-Wulf 190s climbing from the German countryside below. He counts them. 4, 6, now 8 fighters spiraling upward to attack the bomber's exposed belly. The intercom crackles. Ball turret. Bandits, 6 o'clock low. It's Lieutenant Franklin, the pilot. His voice is jagged with adrenaline. "I see him, sir," Bennett replies. He is 18 years old, though in the bulky flight gear he looks like a child playing dress-up. He stands 5 feet 4 inches and weighs 115 pounds. A physique born of Great Depression poverty, yet the only size that fits comfortably in this cramped glass coffin. The other crew members call him Junior. They protect him. What they don't know is that this malnourished teenager from Pennsylvania coal country is about to do the impossible. Bennett squints into his Sperry K4 computing gun sight. The reflector glass should be glowing with an orange reticle, the mathematical aiming point essential for hitting a target moving at 400 miles per hour. But there is a problem. A problem Bennett has hidden for weeks. The sight is dead. Just a piece of dark glass. The manuals say a ball turret gunner without a sight is dead weight. The experts say calculating deflection angles by eye is impossible. But Bennett has stopped listening to the experts. As the FW-190s scream into range, Bennett doesn't panic. He doesn't retreat. He does something that defies every regulation in the United States Army Air Forces. He decides to trust his feelings over the machine. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The Luftwaffe pilots climbing toward Lady Luck believe they are attacking a helpless target. They are about to encounter the most inexplicable anomaly in the European theater. A blind gunner who cannot miss. And what makes him lethal isn't the technology the Army gave him, it's the instinct the Army tried to train out of him. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had turned into a mathematical meat grinder. While the Allies had achieved numerical superiority, the Luftwaffe had changed tactics. They stopped attacking the heavily armed nose and tail of the B-17 formations and focused on the underbelly. The ball turret gunner, suspended alone below the aircraft, became the most targeted man in the sky. The statistics were horrifying. The casualty rate for ball turret gunners hovered near 40%. It was the most claustrophobic, isolated, and dangerous job on the bomber. If the electrical retraction gear failed during a belly landing, the gunner was crushed. If the bomber took a direct hit, the gunner was trapped. But the biggest problem was simply hitting back. 8th Air Force analysts knew the score. Despite the B-17 Flying Fortress being a porcupine of heavy weaponry, the hit rates were abysmal. For a ball turret gunner spinning upside down, trying to track a fighter closing at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour, the physics were overwhelming. A standard .50 caliber bullet takes roughly half a second to travel 600 yards. In that half second, a German fighter moves nearly 300 feet. If the gunner aims at the plane, he misses behind it every time. He must aim into empty sky, visualizing a collision point that hasn't happened yet. To solve this physics equation, the Army spent millions developing the Sperry K4 computing site. It was a marvel of engineering that calculated range and speed to show the gunner exactly where to aim. The doctrine was absolute: trust the sight. Without the sight, you are guessing. And if you guess, you die. But for Walter Bennett, the doctrine was a lie. The vibration of the turret had shattered the delicate electrical connections in his sight weeks ago. The ground crews couldn't fix it permanently without grounding the plane, and Bennett was too terrified of being replaced to report it. He was flying blind in the most dangerous airspace on Earth. So he improvised. While the experts in Washington drew diagrams, Bennett, a high school dropout who had never traveled 50 miles from his home before the war, began to notice patterns the mathematicians missed. He realized the sight was too slow for the chaos of a dogfire. He stopped looking for the reticle and started watching the tracers, the streaks of light his gun spat out. He learned to walk the fire onto the target, painting the sky with lead based on intuition rather than calculation. Walter Wally Bennett was born in November 1925 in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. His father was a coal miner killed in a shaft collapse when Wally was 12. The boy grew up in the shadow of that disaster, learning early that machinery fails and life is fragile. He quit school at 14 to feed his 3 siblings, working odd jobs that required quick hands and sharp eyes. When he walked into the recruiting office in August 1943, lying about his age to enlist, the recruiter saw a scrawny kid looking for a meal ticket. The army saw a body small enough to squeeze between 2 machine guns and a plastic ball. Neither of them knew they were looking at a prodigy. Bennett went through the standard training pipeline at Tyndall Field, Florida. They taught him the K4 sight. They drilled the math of deflection. They told him that mechanical precision was the only way to survive. Bennett nodded, memorized the manuals, and kept his mouth shut. But now, over Berlin with the sight dark and the Germans closing, the manuals are useless. Bennett grips the handles of his twin .50s. He takes a breath of oxygen-thin air. He ignores the dark glass of the broken sight and looks into the empty sky ahead of the lead fighter. He waits for the feeling in his gut that tells him now. He presses the triggers. To understand the miracle of what Bennett achieved, you first have to understand the metal trap he lived in. The Sperry Ball turret was less a crew position than a sentence to solitary confinement at 25,000 feet. It was a 4-foot diameter sphere of aluminum and plexiglass hanging like a tear from the belly of the B-17, powered by electric motors that spun the gunner in a sickening 360-degree dance. Inside, the gunner sat in a fetal crumple, knees pressed hard against his chest, back hunched against the armor plate. He was flanked by 2 heavy .50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, the breeches practically resting against his ears. The fit was so tight there was no room for a parachute. A chest pack was stowed inside the fuselage above him, useless unless he could rotate the turret to the precise entry angle, open the door, and climb back up into the plane. If the bomber took a hit and the electrical system failed, the turret locked in place. If the gears jammed while the exit door was facing empty space, the gunner was sealed in his glass coffin all the way to the ground. The statistics bore out the terror. Casualty rates for ball turret gunners hovered near 40%, a grim figure rivaled only by the exposed nose gunners. By early 1944, despite the armadas of Allied fighters sweeping ahead of the bomber streams, the Luftwaffe remained a lethal professional force. German veterans knew the B-17's geometry perfectly. They knew the flying porcupine had a soft underbelly. They would dive low, accelerate to combat speed, and scream up from below and behind, slashing at the unarmored belly with 20mm cannon fire before breaking away. In that terrifying vertical duel, the ball turret gunner was the ship's only shield. His survival, and the survival of the 10 men riding above him, depended entirely on one piece of complex machinery, the Sperry computing gun sight. This wasn't just a piece of glass. It was an analog computer designed to solve a physics problem that the human brain theoretically could not. At high altitude, a German fighter diving at 400 miles per hour isn't where it appears to be. By the time a bullet travels the 600 yards to the target, the plane has moved hundreds of feet. The sight projected an orange reticle, a ghostly circle of light that calculated the necessary lead, telling the gunner exactly where to aim in empty space to ensure bullet and target arrived at the same point simultaneously. With a functioning sight, a skilled gunner might achieve a hit rate of perhaps 3 to 5%. It was a game of inches played at supersonic closing speeds. Without the sight, the training manuals didn't even bother calculating the odds. Firing without that glowing reticle was considered a waste of ammunition, a blind guess against the laws of physics that would result only in empty shell casings and a dead crew. Yet, as the spring of 1944 dawned over Europe, Walter Bennett was about to face the elite of the Luftwaffe with nothing but a piece of dark glass and a hunch. But to understand how a teenager could defy the strict mathematics of war, you have to look back before the war to a coal-dusted town in Pennsylvania where a 12-year-old boy learned that sometimes, when the lights go out, you have to find your own way in the dark. Walter Wally Bennett entered the world on November 17, 1925, in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, a town where the coal dust settled into the creases of every face and the hierarchy of life was brutal but simple. You either dug for the Clearfield Bituminous Coal Corporation or you starved. His father, John Bennett, spent his life in the subterranean dark, hacking at the seams of the earth, while his mother, Ruth, scrubbed the coal stains out of other men's clothes to put bread on the table. Wally was the oldest of 4 children, raising his siblings in a drafty clapboard house where dinner was never a guarantee and the winter wind cut through the walls like a knife. The fragile stability of their life shattered in 1937. Wally was 12 years old when the foreman arrived at their door, twisting his hat in his hands. There had been a roof collapse in Section C. 4 men were dead, John Bennett among them. The company's sympathy was measured in dollars and cents. They paid the widow 2 months' wages. On the 61st day, the Bennett family was on its own. Education became a luxury they could no longer afford. At 14, Wally left school to fill the void his father had left. But in a region that valued brute strength, Wally was at a disadvantage. He stood only 5 feet 4 inches and weighed barely 115 pounds. He couldn't swing a pickaxe or haul timber, but he was wiry, fast, and possessed a desperate reliability. He delivered groceries, swept the floors of the feed store, and worked odd jobs on construction sites whenever he could pass for older. He handed every nickel to Ruth, but by 1943, watching his mother work herself into an early grave, he knew it wasn't enough. In August 1943, 3 months before his 18th birthday, Wally took a bus to the county seat in Indiana, Pennsylvania. He walked into the Army recruiting office with his chin up, trying to project the toughness his slight frame betrayed. The recruiter, a weary sergeant sitting behind a metal desk, looked up at the kid. He saw the thin wrists and the hollows under the eyes. He likely knew the date of birth on the application was a lie. But it was 1943, the war machine was hungry, and the Army wasn't in the business of turning away volunteers. "You ever been up in an airplane, son?" the sergeant asked, his pen hovering over the stamp. "No, sir," Wally answered. "You scared of heights?" Wally thought of the mines that had taken his father. He thought of the suffocating, crushing dark of the underground, the fate that awaited him if he stayed in Punxsutawney. "No, sir," he said quietly. "Not heights." "Good. Sign here." Wally scratched his signature onto the enlistment papers, believing he was signing a ticket to freedom, an escape from the crushing weight of the earth into the open sky. He had no idea that he was being funneled toward a specialized school in Florida, where instructors were waiting to teach him a dangerous lesson, that a modern airman is nothing without his technology, and that the only thing keeping him alive would be a glass lens he was about to learn to trust more than his own eyes. From the freezing mud of basic training at Fort Dix to the humid firing ranges of Tyndall Field, Florida, the Army Air Forces drilled one commandment into Walter Bennett's head: trust the machine. The Sperry K4 reflector sight wasn't just a tool, it was salvation. Instructors paced the firing lines, preaching the gospel of deflection like revivalist ministers. "Your eyes lie," they shouted over the rattle of practice fire. "At 300 miles an hour, your gut is wrong. The math is right. Put the bandit in the reticle. Trust the rings. Let the sight do the thinking." Bennett was a believer. He was methodical, quiet, the kind of student who memorized the manual because he was terrified of failing. When he arrived at RAF Polbrook in January 1944 to join the 351st Bombardment Group, assigned to the ball turret of B-17G Lady Luck, he brought that faith with him. But the skies over Germany weren't like the clear air over the Gulf of Mexico. Combat was a sensory assault where hydraulic oil thickened to molasses in the sub-zero cold, and enemy fighters didn't tow banners. They spit 20mm cannon shells. And the equipment, hammered by vibration and frozen by the slipstream, began to revolt. The ball turret was an electrical nightmare, a maze of circuits powering motors, heaters, and guns, all channeled through a complex wiring bundle that twisted every time the turret rotated. On his first mission to Frankfurt in February, the sight held true. On the second run to Nuremberg, the orange reticle flickered, a momentary blink in the darkness that made Bennett's heart skip. By the third mission to Augsburg, the aiming point dimmed to a ghost just as the bomb bay doors opened, only to surge back to life minutes later when the danger had passed. "It's likely a short in the main bundle," a harassed electrical specialist told him on the hard stand, wiping grease from his hands. "It twists every time you traverse. To fix it right, we'd have to strip the whole turret." The 351st didn't have time to strip turrets. The invasion of Europe was looming, and every airframe was needed. The crew chief promised to patch it, but Bennett looked at the fraying wires and knew the truth. The fix was a Band-Aid. He stood there, 18 years old and shivering in his flight jacket, paralyzed by the fear of being labeled a washout. In Punxsutawney, you didn't complain that your shovel was broken. You just dug harder. You didn't let the other men down. So Bennett made a choice that would have terrified his instructors. He climbed back into the glass sphere, plugged in his heated suit, and said nothing. He decided he would just make do. But as Lady Luck began her taxi roll for the next mission, Bennett didn't realize that making do at 25,000 feet was about to force him into a confrontation with the laws of physics that no amount of grit could solve. The target was the Big B, Berlin, and the Luftwaffe was waiting in the clouds with a lesson that wasn't in any manual. The armada of 600 bombers droned toward Berlin, the deepest the 8th Air Force had ever thrust into the heart of the Reich. March 6, 1944. The sky was a chaotic canvas of flak bursts and contrails, but inside the ball turret of Lady Luck, The world had shrunk to a terrifying stillness. Bennett checked his systems. The rotation motors hummed smoothly. The solenoids on his twin .50s clicked responsively. But when he peered into the K4 sight, searching for the reassuring glow of the reticle, he found only dead, gray glass. He slapped the housing with a gloved fist. Nothing. He wiggled the cannon plug connection. Tight. The sight wasn't just flickering this time, it was stone dead. 2,000 yards below, 4 Focke-Wulf 190s were initiating their attack run. Bennett knew the tactic by heart. Dive to build kinetic energy, then pitch up into a vertical climb, hammering the bomber's belly with 20mm cannon shells before stalling out and falling away. They were sharks coming up from the deep, and Bennett was dangling in the water with a broken spear. Panic surged hot and choking. He ran the calculus in a split second. Tell the pilot? Useless at 25,000 feet. Hold fire? That was suicide for the whole crew. Shoot blind? A waste of ammo. Then, staring through the plexiglass at the gray shapes swelling in size, his mind latched onto a single detail. The tracers. Every fifth round in his ammunition belts was a tracer, a magnesium-tipped bullet that burned bright orange. The manual said they were for confirmation, a way to check your math. Bennett decided to use them for something else. Guidance. The lead Focke-Wulf committed, nose rising, wings winking as its cannons flashed. Bennett stomped on his pedals, spinning the turret. He didn't look through the dead sight. He looked through the glass, swinging the massive guns by feel, pointing them into the empty air where he guessed the fighter would be. He pressed the triggers. Twin streams of orange fire erupted. The first burst arced behind the German fighter. Too much lead. Bennett didn't calculate, he reacted. He eased the pressure on the turret controls, walking the orange streams backward, painting the sky until the lines of fire intersected with the dark shape of the plane. He wasn't aiming anymore. He was feeling the geometry of the fight. The Focke-Wulf flew directly into the saw blade of fire. Chunks of duralumin ripped off the wing. The fighter snapped into a violent roll, smoke pouring from its engine, and fell away. Bennett had no time to breathe. The second fighter was already climbing. This time there was no hesitation. Bennett swung, fired, and watched the orange lines. He adjusted instantly, left, up, there, and the tracers converged on the canopy. The glass shattered, and the plane tumbled into a flat spin. By the third fighter, Bennett was in a trance. The vibration of the guns rattled his teeth, but his vision was crystal clear. He was conducting with light, guiding the streams of fire with a terrifying fluidity. The third FW-190 took the full weight of the burst in its engine block and disintegrated in a fireball. The fourth pilot saw the carnage and broke off, diving away from the lethal glass sphere that was somehow seeing the unseeable. Hours later, on the hardstand at RAF Polbrook, Bennett climbed out of the turret on legs that felt like jelly. He leaned against the cold aluminum of the fuselage, trying to stop his hands from shaking. Lieutenant Morrison, the navigator, walked up and slapped him on the shoulder. Hell of a show, Wally. 3 confirmed? You were a buzzsaw today. Bennett looked up, his face pale where the oxygen mask had dug in. Sight's been broken the whole mission, sir. Morrison froze. Broken. Dead. No reticle. Nothing. Then how the hell did you? Morrison trailed off, staring at the teenager with a look that hovered between skepticism and awe. Bennett didn't have an answer, but as he looked at his grease-stained hands, he realized that surviving the mission hadn't solved his problem. It had only deepened the mystery of what he was becoming. The intelligence debriefing room smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat. Bennett sat across from a tired captain, his voice barely a murmur as he reported the impossible. 3 kills. 2 confirmed by the waist gunners, 1 probable. When he mentioned the site failure, he kept it casual, a throwaway line to avoid scrutiny. The captain merely grunted and scribbled a note about electrical maintenance. In the 8th Air Force, equipment broke every day. What mattered was that the bombers came back. But inside, Bennett was reeling. He felt like a man who had walked across a tightrope in the dark and survived only by luck. He wasn't sure he could do it again. The training manuals were clear. Without the sight, you are blind. And yet, the blindness had saved him. As February bled into March, the problem with the K4 sight refused to vanish. It became a ghostly malfunction, working perfectly during pre-flight checks, only to flicker and die at altitude or worse, dim intermittently during combat. The ground crew chased the gremlin through the wiring bundles, cleaning contacts and replacing fuses, but the vibration of the turret always shook something loose. Bennett made a decision he whispered to no one, not even the pilot. He was done trusting the machine. On the March 18th mission to Friedrichshafen, His sight hummed to life, the orange reticle glowing bright and steady. Bennett ignored it. When the German fighters peeled off to attack, he looked past the illuminated circle and focused on the empty air. He trusted the feeling in his gut over the optics in front of his face. 2 more Focke-Wulfs fell to his guns that day. He was developing a method now, a dark art that defied every lesson taught at Tyndall Field. The instructors preached conservation and calculation. Wait for range, calculate lead, fire short bursts. Bennett did the opposite. His technique was fluid, almost musical. First, he threw out the math. Combat moved too fast for algebra. Second, he fired early, long before the enemy was in effective range, sending a stream of tracers arcing into the void. These weren't bullets meant to kill, they were feelers. Third, he stopped watching the plane and started watching the tracers, treating the glowing magnesium streaks like water from a hose. He would adjust in real time, wrestling the turret to bend the stream of fire until it intersected with the flight path of the fighter. When the 2 lines, the tracers and the target, finally converged, he didn't tap the trigger. He held it down. He poured fire into the intersection point, flooding the space where the German plane had to go. It was a technique of brute force and high-speed intuition, and it was utterly exhausting. Tracking a target in 3 dimensions while compensating for the bomber's movement, the turret's rotation, and the fighter's evasion required a level of mental processing that left Bennett physically wrecked. He would stumble out of the turret after missions, his flight suit soaked in cold sweat, his hands trembling so hard he couldn't hold a cigarette. But it worked. He was surviving. Yet Bennett knew that surviving sporadic attacks was one thing. Facing the full fury of the Luftwaffe was another. He was getting better, sharper, deadlier. He would need to be. Because the calendar was turning to April 13th, and the target orders coming down from headquarters bore a name that made even veteran pilots shudder. Schweinfurt. April 13th, 1944. The target board simply read Schweinfurt. For the veteran crews of the 8th Air Force, the name was synonymous with suicide. The ball-bearing factories deep in Bavaria were among the most heavily defended targets in the Reich, protected by a ring of flak and the elite squadrons of the Luftwaffe. As the 351st Bomb Group joined the 300 bomber stream, the sky turned black with bursts of 88mm shells. Then the fighters came. They attacked in waves, a savage tide of metal crashing against the bomber formation. Bennett's turret was in constant, nauseating motion. The first wave consisted of Messerschmitt Bf 109 screaming up from below. Bennett's sight was actually functioning, the reticle glowed bright orange, but he looked right through it. He didn't need the ghost ring anymore. He tracked the lead fighter by eye, gauging the curve of its climb. He fired, watching his tracers stitch a lethal line across the sky. The 109 flew directly into the stream, its wings shearing off at the root. Confirmed. The second wave hit from 5 o'clock low. Focke-Wulf 190s. Bennett spun the turret, ignoring the dizziness, and locked onto the trailing aircraft. He walked his tracers up the enemy's fuselage, feeling the impact through the vibration of his own guns. The fighter rolled inverted, spewing flame, and dropped away. Second confirmed. But the true test came during the bomb run. The B-17s had to fly straight and level to give the bombardiers a stable platform. They were sitting ducks. A lone FW-190, sensing the vulnerability, initiated a near-suicidal head-on pass from below. He was coming straight at Lady Luck, closing at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. At that speed, the K4 sight was useless. The math couldn't keep up. Bennett didn't think. He didn't calculate. He simply reacted. He clamped the triggers down, unleashing a continuous torrent of lead, 70 rounds in 3 seconds. The tracer stream and the fighter intersected for a fraction of a heartbeat. The Focke-Wulf's engine cowling disintegrated. The plane flipped nose down violently and vanished. 3 kills. In a single mission. It was a score most fighter pilots didn't achieve in a month. When Lady Luck touched down at Polbrook, the adrenaline crash left Bennett shaking. As the crews debriefed, the word buzzsaw was whispered around the Nissen huts. They were talking about the kid in the ball turret. That night, Lieutenant Franklin, the pilot, found Bennett alone in the barracks, polishing his boots to keep his hands busy. "Wally," Franklin said, his voice low. "Your sight's been broken for weeks, hasn't it?" Bennett froze. The brush stopped moving. He had been caught. The deception was over. Now came the grounding, the court-martial, the shame of being exposed as a liability. "Yes, sir," Bennett whispered, not looking up. "I'm sorry, sir. I should have reported it. I just didn't want to be." "Sorry?" Franklin cut him off, stepping closer. Kid, you just shot down 3 fighters in one day with broken equipment. I don't want an apology. I want to know how the hell you are doing this. Bennett looked up, stunned. He expected discipline, but he saw only bewilderment in his pilot's eyes. But the pilot's knowledge was a dangerous thing. A secret this big couldn't stay contained in the barracks. The official reports were already making their way up the chain of command, and they were about to land on the desk of a major who didn't believe in miracles, only in court-martials. The anomaly on the intelligence reports could no longer be ignored. By early May, the 351st Bomb Group headquarters was buzzing with a rumor that defied military logic. Sergeant Bennett had accumulated 8 confirmed kills in 2 months, yet the maintenance logs for Lady Luck indicated his gun sight had been flagged as intermittent or inoperative for the same period. Major Kiley, the group operations officer, stared at the paperwork with the cynicism of a man who had seen too many tall tales. "It's impossible," he muttered. "The kid is either the luckiest son of a bitch in the 8th Air Force, or other gunners are making the kills and he's claiming the credit." But the evidence in the developing room told a different story. The gun camera footage from Bennett's turret was pulled for review. The film flickered on the projector screen, showing grainy black and white sequences of German fighters disintegrating under fire. But one thing was missing. In standard footage, the ghostly ring of the reflector sight reticle is visible, superimposed over the target. On Bennett's film, there was no ring. Just the raw sky, the enemy plane, and the tracers. The equipment wasn't working, but the gunner was. To settle the matter, Major Richard Harlow, a command pilot and gunnery specialist, assigned himself to Lady Luck for the May 8th mission to Brunswick. His orders were simple: observe the boy, verify the kills, and determine if Bennett was a fraud or a liability. Before the engines turned over in the pre-dawn gray, Harlow climbed into the fuselage and signaled for Bennett to rotate the turret so he could inspect the site. He toggled the switch. The reticle flickered weakly, ghosted out, and died. "This is what you've been working with?" Harlow asked, his voice flat over the interphone. "Yes, sir," Bennett replied, his voice small. Harlow didn't scold him. He just nodded in the dim light. "Show me what you do." The mission to Brunswick was a grinder. The Luftwaffe hit the formation just after the IP, desperate to stop the bombers from reaching the city. From the waist window, Harlow had a front-row seat to Bennett's performance. He watched as Bennett swung the turret toward a diving Bf-109. Harlow expected to see the hesitation of a man firing blind. Instead, he saw a fluid, continuous motion. Bennett didn't wait for the sight picture. He began firing early, using the tracers as long, fiery fingers to feel for the enemy. Harlow watched, mesmerized, as Bennett adjusted the stream, not in jerky, calculated movements, but in a smooth sweep. The tracers and the fighter merged in a deadly harmony. The Bf-109 shuddered as the rounds found its engine, breaking off in a trail of black smoke. Minutes later, a second fighter committed to an attack. Bennett repeated the performance, walking the fire into the cockpit until the plane exploded. Upon landing, there was no court-martial. Major Harlow went straight to his typewriter. "Sergeant Bennett has developed an instinctive fire control method that functions independent of mechanical sight systems," he wrote in his official observation report. "His technique relies on real-time tracer observation and predictive tracking. Hit probability appears equal to or exceeding that achieved by gunners using functional sights." The report went all the way to 8th Air Force headquarters. The Army, rigid and bureaucratic, had intended to discipline a soldier for failing to maintain his equipment. Instead, they found themselves staring at a revelation that challenged their entire training doctrine. Bennett wasn't grounded, he was studied. But as the brass debated the implications of instinctive gunnery, Bennett was quietly preparing for his final missions, unaware that the strangest chapter of his war wasn't the fighting. It was what the numbers would reveal once the guns finally went silent. By June 1944, Walter Bennett had transformed from the quiet kid in the corner of the barracks into a reluctant oracle. New replacements, fresh from the States with their uniforms still stiff, would find him in the mess hall, asking the same question: "How do you do it?" They wanted the secret formula, the trick that turned a ball turret, the position with the highest mortality rate in the squadron, into a hunter's blind. Bennett struggled to put it into words. How do you explain to a man trained on sine waves and tangent tables that he needs to stop thinking? "You can't calculate it," Bennett would tell them, his hands moving in the air as if tracing a phantom plane. "The sight tries to tell you where to aim, but by the time you look at the ring and pull the trigger, the German is gone. You have to feel where he's going. Watch the tracers. Let them show you the air." Most of them stared back blankly. They had spent 8 weeks in gunnery school learning to worship the Sperry K4 sight. To ignore it felt like jumping out of the plane without a chute. Bennett realized that his advantage was born of desperation. He had learned to see the truth of combat only because his mechanical eyes had been gouged out. On June 20, 1944, Lady Luck formed up for the run to the synthetic oil refineries near Hamburg. It was Bennett's 25th mission, the magic number that meant a ticket home. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them, but the opposition was moderate. A single Focke-Wulf 190 made the fatal error of climbing directly into Bennett's sector from below. For the last time, Bennett ignored the dark glass of his sight. He watched the fighter, felt the rhythm of the engagement, and walked his fire into the cockpit. The fighter fell away, the 8th and final notch on Bennett's guns. When he climbed out of the turret that afternoon, he was done. But while Bennett packed his bags for Pennsylvania, the operational research section of the 8th Air Force was just beginning to unpack his record. The statisticians in High Wycombe crunched the numbers, and the results were baffling. The average ball turret gunner, completing a full 25 mission tour, claimed 0.7 kills. Bennett had 8. But the truly disturbing statistic was accuracy. The average gunner, using a functioning computing sight, achieved a hit rate of roughly 3.8%. Bennett, firing on pure instinct with broken equipment, had a hit rate of 4.2%. The conclusion was a shock to the military establishment. The teenage coal miner was statistically more lethal without the computer than with it. The analysts theorized that in the chaos of a 600 miles per hour dogfight, the act of consulting a mechanical sight introduced a fatal neurological delay. The sight forced the brain to process data. Instinct simply forced the hand to act. Bennett hadn't just survived a breakdown in technology. He had proven that in the extremes of human conflict, the oldest computer, the human brain, was still superior to the machine. Bennett handed in his flight gear, eager to return to the anonymity of civilian life. He assumed his war was just a strange, isolated anomaly that would be forgotten as soon as the ink dried on his discharge papers. He was wrong. The Army Air Forces had archived his story, but it would take decades for the world to understand that the lesson learned in the skies over Germany wasn't just about guns. It was about the hidden capacity lying dormant in us all, waiting for the moment when our safety nets finally break. In July 1944, Sergeant Walter Bennett stepped off a train in Philadelphia, his war over as abruptly as a film strip snapping in a projector. The Army Air Forces, recognizing the peculiar genius of the boy who could aim without eyes, offered him a prestigious post as a gunnery instructor. They wanted him to teach the recruits how to see the invisible. Bennett respectfully declined. He had spent enough time in glass cages. He just wanted to go home. He returned to Punxsutawney, to the clapboard house that still smelled of coal dust and boiled cabbage. But things had changed. His brothers were taller, his sister was in school, and the war economy had finally lifted the boot from the neck of rural Pennsylvania. Nobody was starving anymore. Bennett slipped back into civilian life with the same quiet adaptability he had shown in the turret. He took a job at Miller's garage, expecting to sweep floors, but soon found his hands covered in grease under the hood of a Ford. It turned out that the talent wasn't just for killing. The same uncanny, intuitive connection that allowed him to track Focke-Wulfs in the chaos of the stratosphere made him a savant with engines. He didn't need diagnostic manuals. He could listen to the idle of a straight six or feel the vibration of a transmission through the floorboards and know exactly which bearing was shot. He fixed things by feel, diagnosing mechanical pain before the parts even broke. In 1946, he married Helen Kowalski, a girl with a bright laugh from the next town over. They had 3 children. Bennett became a fixture of the town, the quiet mechanic who could fix anything but rarely spoke more than necessary. To his neighbors he was just Wally. To his children he was Dad. The distinguished flying cross and the air medal with 3 oak leaf clusters were wrapped in a velvet cloth and shoved to the back of a sock drawer, buried beneath the mundane debris of a peaceful life. But while Bennett forgot the war didn't forget him. In 1947, as the Army Air Forces transitioned into the United States Air Force, a revised gunnery training manual was issued to bases worldwide. Buried deep in the technical appendices was a new section titled, Instinctive Tracking Methods and Tracer-Guided Fire Control. It never mentioned Walter Bennett by name. It simply codified the impossible, instructing airmen that when technology fails, the human eye and the human gut must take over. The method that had saved Lady Luck became doctrine, a quiet legacy printed in black ink on government paper. Decades passed. The B-17s were scrapped, melted down into aluminum siding and beer cans. Bennett grew old, his hands stiffening, his eyes dimming. The world moved on. Then, in the late 1980s, an aviation historian named Thomas McKelvey was digging through the dusty, declassified operational archives of the 351st Bomb Group. He was looking for routine mission logs. What he found instead was a statistical anomaly that made no sense. He found a gunner with a perfect kill record during a 3-month period where maintenance logs listed his equipment as non-operational. McKelvey assumed it was a clerical error. He cross-referenced the serial numbers. He checked the crew manifest. He pulled the original observation report from Major Harlow. The more he dug, the more the impossible numbers stared back at him. He realized he wasn't looking at an error. He was looking at a ghost story. McKelvey finally tracked down a phone number in rural Pennsylvania. He sat by his phone for an hour, wondering if he should call, wondering if the old man on the other end would even remember. He dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a gravelly voice answered. "Mr. Bennett?" McKelvey asked. "My name is Thomas. I'm looking at a report from 1944 that says you did the impossible. I need to know if it's true." There was a long silence on the line, breathless and heavy. Then the old mechanic let out a short, dry chuckle. "Son," Bennett said, "you have no idea what impossible looks like until you see what we found inside that turret when we finally took it apart." For decades, Bennett's medal sat hidden in a dark drawer. He never bragged. He never asked for fame. He passed away quietly, content to let his miracle fade into history. But we shouldn't be content with that. If you made it this far, you owe it to his memory to make sure others hear this story too. Leaving a like and a comment helps push this video to people who have no idea who Walter Bennett is. Don't let this story end with you. Subscribe and help us keep his legacy alive.